Table of Contents. Translator's Preface, Translator's Introduction, Introduction to the Pursuit of Being, the Phenomenon of Being, and the Being of the Phenomenon, the Pre-Reflection, Cogito, and the Being of Percepi, the Ontological Proof, Being in Itself, Part 1, The Problem of Nothingness, Chapter 1, The Origin of Negation, The Question, Negations, the Dialectical Concept of Nothingness. The phenomenological concept of nothingness, the origin of nothingness. Chapter 2, Bad Faith and Falsehood, Patterns of Bad Faith, the Faith of Bad Faith. Part 2, Being for Itself. Chapter 1, Immediate Structures of the For Itself, Presence to Self, Facticity of the For Itself, and the Being of Value, the For Itself and the Being of Possibilities, the Self and the Circuit of Selfness. Chapter 2, Temporality, Phenomenology of the Three Temporal Dimensions, the Ontology of Temporality, Original Temporality and the Psychic Temporality Reflection. Chapter 3, Transcendence, Knowledge as a type of relation between the For Itself and the In Itself, Determination as negation, Quality and quantity, potentiality, instrumentality, the time of the world, knowledge. Part 3, Being for Others. Chapter 1, The Existence of Others, the Problem, the Reef of Sophocleism, Husserl, Hegel, and Heidegger. The Look. Chapter 2, The Body. The body is being for itself, facticity. The body for others, the third ontological dimensions of the body. Chapter 3, Concrete Relations with Others. First attitude toward others, love language, masochism. Second attitude towards others, indifference, desire, hate, sadism. Being with, Mitsein, and the we. Part 4, Having, Doing, and Being. Chapter 1, Being and Doing, Freedom. Freedom, the first condition of action. Freedom and facticity, the situation. Freedom and responsibility. Chapter 2, Doing and Having. Existential psychoanalysis. Doing and having possession. Quality as a revelation of being. Conclusion. In itself and for itself, metaphysical implications. Ethical implications. Key to special terminology. Index. Introduction, The Pursuit of Being, the Phenomenon. Modern thought has realized considerable progress by reducing the existence to the series of appearances which manifests itself. Its aim was to overcome a certain number of dualisms which have embarrassed philosophy and to replace them by the monism of the phenomenon. Has the attempt been successful? In the first place, we certainly thus get rid of the dualism which in the existent opposes interior to exterior. There is no longer an interior for the existent, is if one means by that a superficial covering which hides from sight the true nature of the object, and this true nature in turn, if it is to be the secret reality of the thing, which one can have a presentiment of or which one can suppose but can never reach because it is the interior of the object under consideration. This nature no longer exists. The appearances which manifest the existence are neither interior nor exterior. They are all equal. They all refer to other appearances, and none of them is privileged. Force, for example, is not a metaphysical kenosis of an unknown kind which hides behind its effects, accelerations, deviations, etc. It is the totality of these effects. Similarly, an electric current does not have a secret reverse side. It is nothing but the totality of the physical chemical actions which manifests it. Electrolysis, the incandescence of a carbon filament, the displacement of the needle of a galvanometer, etc. No one of these actions alone is sufficient to itself. It indicates only itself and the total series. The obvious conclusion is that the dualism of being and appearance is no longer entitled to any legal status within philosophy. The appearance refers to the total series of appearances and not to the hidden reality which would drain to itself all the being of the existent, and the appearance, for its part, is not an inconsistent manifestation of this being, to the extent that men had believed in nominal realities that have been presented appearance as a pure negation. It was that which is not being, it had no other being than that of illusion and error. But even this being was borrowed, it was itself a pretense, and philosophers met with the greatest difficulty in maintaining cohesion and existence in the appearance, so that it should not itself be reabsorbed in the depth of non-phenomenal being. But if we once get away from what Nietzsche called the illusion of worlds behind the scene, and if we no longer believe in the being, the appearance, then the appearance becomes full positivity. Its essence is an appearing which is no longer opposed to being, but on the contrary is the measure of it. For the being of existent is exactly what it appears. Thus we arrive at the idea of phenomenon, such as we can find, for example, in the phenomenology of Husserl or Heidegger. The phenomenon, or the relative absolute relative the phenomenon remains for to appear, supposes in essence somebody to whom to appear, but it does not have the double relativity of Kant's Erfahrung, which it does not point over its shoulder to true being, which would be for it absolute. What it is absolutely, for it reveals itself as it is. The phenomenon can be studied and described as such, for it is absolutely indicative of itself, and described as such, for it is absolutely indicative of itself. The duality of potency and act falls by the same stroke. The act is everything. Behind the act there is nothing potency. The act is everything. Behind the act there is neither potency, nor hexis, nor virtue. We shall refuse, for example, to understand by genius in the sense in which we say that understand by genius in the sense in which we say that understand by genius in the sense by which we say that Proust had genius, or that he was a genius, a particular. Proust had genius, or that he was a genius, a particular capacity to produce certain works which was not exhausted exactly in producing them. The genius of Proust is neither the work considered in isolation nor the subjective ability to produce it. It is the work considered as the totality of the manifestations of a person. That is why we can equally well reject the dualism of appearance and essence. The appearance does not hide the essence, it reveals it. It is the essence. The essence of an existent is no longer a property sunk in the cavity of the existent. It is the manifest law which presides over the succession of its appearances. It is the principles of the series to the nominalism of Poincare. The finding of physical reality and electric current, for example, as the sum of its various manifestations. Duhem rightly opposed his own theory, which makes the concept of synthetic unity of manifestations, to be sure, phenomenology, is anything but a nominalism. But essence, as the principle of the series, is definitively only the concatenation of appearances, that is itself an appearance. This explains how it is possible to have an intuition of essences. The Western central of Husserl, for example, the phenomenon being manifests itself, it manifests its essence as well as its existence, and it is nothing but the well-connected series of its manifestations. Does this mean that by reducing the existence to manifestations we have succeeded in overcoming all dualisms? It seems rather that we have converted them into a new dualism, that a finite and infinite, yet the existence in fact cannot be reduced to a finite series of manifestations, since each one of them is a relation to a subject constantly changing. Although an object may disclose itself only through a single abstratum, the sole fact of there being a subject implies the possibility of multiplying the points of view on that abstractum. That suffices to multiply to infinity the abstractum under consideration. Furthermore, if the series of abstractum under consideration, if the series of appearances were infinite, that would mean that the first appearances do not have the possibility of reappearing, which is absurd, or that they can be given at once, which is still more absurd. Let us understand indeed that our theory of the phenomenon has replaced the reality of the thing by the objectivity of the phenomenon, and that it has been based this an appeal to infinity. The reality of that cup is that it is there, not me. We shall interpret this by saying the series of its appearances is bound a principle which does not depend on my whim, by the appearance reduced to itself without reference to the series of which it is a part, could be only intuitive, subjective. Promptitude. The manner in which the subject is affected. If the phenomenon to reveal itself is transcendent, it is necessary that the subject himself transcend the appearance towards the total series of which is a member. He must seize red through his impression of red. But red is not the principle of the series, the electric current through the electrosis, etc. But if the transcendence of the object is based on the necessity of causing the appearance to always be transcended, the result is on the principle an object opposite the series of its appearances as infinite. Thus the appearance which the finite indicates itself in its finitude, but at the same time is ordered to grasp the appearance of that which appears. It requires that it is surpassed towards infinity. This new opposition of the finite and the infinite, or better, the infinite in the finite, replaces the dualism in the being and appearance. What appears in fact is only the aspect of the object, and the object is altogether in that aspect and manifests itself in that aspect. It shows itself as the structure of the appearance, which is at the same time the principle of the series. It is altogether outside, for the series will never appear, nor can it appear. Thus outside is opposed in a new way to the inside, and the being which does not appear to the appearance. Similarly, a certain potency returns to inhabit the phenomenon and confer on its very transcendence a potency to be developed in a series of real or possible appearances. The genius of Proust, even when reduced to the works produced, is no less the equivalent to the infinity of possible points of which one can take on that work, in which we will call the inexhaustibility of Proust's work, but it is not the inexhaustibility which implies the transcendence in reference to the infinite. Is this not a hexis, at which exact moment when apprehends it on the object, the essence finally is radically severed from the individual appearance which manifests it, since the principle is that which must be able to manifest by infinite series of individual manifestations, and thus replacing a variety of oppositions by a single dualism on which they are all based, we have gained or lost. This shall we soon see. For the moment, the first consequence of the theory of the phenomenon is that appearance does not refer to the being as Kant's phenomenon refers to non-phenomenon, since there is nothing behind appearance, and since it indicates only itself in the total series of appearances, it cannot be supported by any being other than its own. The appearance cannot be the thin film of nothingness. If the essence of the appearance is appearing, which is no longer opposed to any being, there arises a legitimate problem concerning the being of the appearing. It is this a problem which will be our first concern, and which will be the point of departure for our inquiry into being and nothingness, the phenomenon of being and the being of the phenomenon. The appearance is not supported by any existent for itself. It has its own being. The first being which we meet in ontological inquiry is the being of appearance. It is it itself an appearance. It seems so at first. The phenomenon is what manifests itself, and being manifests itself to all in some way, since we can speak of it and since we have a certain comprehension of it. Thus there must be for it a phenomenon of being, an appearance of being capable for description. As such being will be disclosed to us by some kind of immediate access, boredom, nausea, etc., and an ontology will be the description of the phenomenon of being as it manifests itself, that is, without intermediary. However, for an ontology we have should arise a preliminary question: is the phenomenon of being thus achieved identical with being a phenomenon? In other words, is the being which discloses itself to me, which appears to me, of the same nature of the being of existence which appeared to me? It seems that there is no difficulty. Husserl has shown how an immediate reduction is always possible. That is how one can always pass beyond the concrete phenomenon towards its essence. For Heidegger also, human reality is ontological. That is, it can always pass beyond the phenomenon towards its being, but the passage from a particular object to essence is a passage from the homogeneous to the homogeneous. Is it the same for the passage from the existence to the phenomenon of being? Is passing beyond existence towards the phenomenon of being actually to pass beyond it toward its being as one passes beyond the particular read towards its essence? Let's consider further. In particular object, one can always distinguish qualities like color, order, etc., and proceeding from this, one can apply its meaning. The totally object essence makes a meaning of the object principle the series of appearances which discloses it, but being is neither one of the object's qualities capable of being apprehended among others, nor a meaning of the object. The object does not refer to being as a signification. It would be impossible, for example, to define being as presence, essence, absence to discloses being, since not to be there seems to be. The object does not possess as being. Its existence is not a participation in being, nor any other or kind of relation. It is that the only way to define its manner of being. The object does not hide being, but neither does it reveal being. The object does not hide it, for it would be futile to try to push aside certain qualities of the existent in order to find the being behind them. Being is being of them all equally. The object does not reveal being, for it would be futile to address oneself to the object in order to apprehend its being. The existence is phenomenon. This to apprehend its being, the existence is phenomenon. This means that it designates itself as an organized totality of qualities. It designates itself and does not its being. Being is simply the condition of all revelation. It is being for revealing, eter por devalere, and not revealed being etri devali. What then is the meaning of this passing towards the ontological of which Heidegger speaks? Certainly I can pass beyond the table or this chair towards its being, and raise the question of the being of the table and the chair, or the being of the chair, but at the moment turn my eyes away from the phenomenon of the table in order to concentrate on the phenomenon of being, which is no longer the condition of all revelation, but which is itself something revealed, an appearance which as such needs in turn being on a basis on which it is revealed itself. If the being of the phenomenon is not resolved in a phenomenon of being, it is nevertheless we cannot say anything about being without considering this phenomenon or the being. Then the exact relation which unites the phenomenon of being to the being of the phenomenon must be established. First of all, we can do this more easily if we consider that the whole of the preceding remarks has been directly being, by not considering being as a condition of revelation, but rather being as an appearance which can be determined in concepts. We have understood, first of all, that knowledge cannot be itself given account of being. That is, the being of the phenomenon cannot be reduced to the phenomenon of the being. In a word, the phenomenon of being is ontological, in the sense that we can speak the ontological proof of St. Anselm and Descartes. It is an appeal to being. It requires, as a phenomenon, a foundation which is trans-phenomenal. The phenomenon of being requires the transphenomenality of being. That does not mean that being is found hidden behind phenomena. We have seen that phenomenon cannot hide being, nor the phenomenon is an appearance which refers to a distinct being. The phenomenon exists only qua appearance, that is, indicates itself on the foundation of being. What is implied by the preceding considerations is that the being of phenomenon, although coexistent with the phenomenon, cannot be subjected to the phenomenon condition, which is to exist only in so far as it reveals itself, and that consequently it surpasses the knowledge which we have of it and provides the basis for such knowledge. The pre-reflective cogito and the being of percepere. One will perhaps be tempted to reply that the difficulties mentioned above all pertain to a certain conception of being, to a kind of ontological realism entirely incompatible with the very notion of appearance. What determines the being of the appearance is in fact that it appears, and since we have restricted reality to the phenomenon, we can say of the phenomenon that it is as it appears. Why not push the idea to its limit and say that the being of the appearance is as it is appearing? This is simply a way of choosing new words to clothe the old. Esse est percepi of Berkeley, and it is in fact what Husserl and his followers are doing when they are, after having effected the phenomenological reduction, they that the noma as unreal and declare that is esse and is percepi. It seems that the famous formula of Berkeley cannot satisfy us for two essential reasons, one concerning the nature of the percepi, the other that of the percepere. The nature of the percepere. If every metaphysics in fact presupposes a theory of knowledge, every theory of knowledge in turn presupposes metaphysics. This means, among every other thing, that an idealism intent on reducing being to the knowledge which we have of it ought first to give some kind of guarantee for the being of knowledge, if one beings, on the other hand, by taking the knowledge as a given, without being concerned to establish a basis for its being. And if one then confirms that esse est percepi, the totality perceived perception lacks the support of a solid being and so falls away in nothingness. Thus the being of knowledge cannot be measured by knowledge, it not subject to the percepi. Therefore the foundation of being, l'être fondament for the percepere, and the percepi cannot itself be subject to the percepi. It must be transphenomenal. Let us return now to our point of departure. We can always agree that the percepi refers to a being not subject to the laws of the appearance, but we still maintain that the transphenomenal being is the being of the subject. Thus percepi would refer to percepiens, and known to knowledge, and knowledge to the being who knows, in his capacity as being, not as being known. That is, knowledge refers to consciousness. This is what Husserl understood, for if the noma is for him an unreal correlate of gnosis, if its ontological law is the percepi, the gnosis, on the contrary, appears to him as reality, of which the principal characteristic is to give itself to the reflection which knows it as having already been there before. For the law of being and the knowledge is subject to be conscious. Consciousness is not a mode of particular knowledge, which may be called an inner being or self-knowledge. It is the dimension of transphenomenal being in the subject. Let us look more closely at the dimension of being. We say that consciousness is the knowing being in his capacity as being and not as being known. This means that we must abandon the primacy of knowledge. If we wish to establish that knowledge, of course, consciousness can know and know itself, but it is in itself something other than knowledge turned back upon itself. All consciousness, as Husserl has shown, is consciousness of something. This means that there is no consciousness which is a positioning of the transcendent object, or if you prefer, that consciousness has no content. We must renounce these neutral givens which, according to the system of reference chosen, find their place either in the world or in the psyche. A table is not in consciousness, not in the capacity of representation. A table is in space, besides the window, etc. The existence of the table, in fact, is the center of opacity for consciousness. It would require an infinite process to inventory the total contents of a thing. To introduce this opacity into consciousness would be to refer to infinity the inventory which it can make of itself to make consciousness a thing, and to deny the cogito. The first procedure of the philosophy ought to be to expel things from consciousness and to re-establish its true connection with the world. To know that consciousness is a position, a consciousness of the world, all consciousness is positional, and that it transcends itself in order to reach an object. It exhausts itself in the same positioning. All that there is an intention. My actual consciousness is directed towards the outside, towards the table. All my judgments are practical activities. All my present inclinations transcend themselves. They aim at the table and are absorbed in it. Not all consciousness is knowledge. There are states of effective consciousnness. For example, all-knowing consciousness can be knowledge only of its object. However, the necessary and sufficient condition for knowing consciousness to be knowledge of its object is it be consciousness of itself. As being that knowledge, this consciousness of being consciousness of the table, it would then be consciousness of that table without consciousness of being so. In other words, it would be consciousness ignorant of itself, and unconscious, which is absurd. This is a sufficient condition. For my being conscious of that table suffices in fact for me to be conscious of it. That is, of course, not sufficient to permit me to affirm that this table exists in itself, but rather that it exists for me. What is the consciousness of consciousness? Oh my God. What is the consciousness of consciousness? We suffer to such an extent for the illusion of the primacy of knowledge that we are immediately ready to make of the consciousness of consciousness an idea in the manner of Spinoza. That is knowledge of knowledge. Elaine, wanting to express the obvious to know it is to be conscious of knowing, interprets in these terms to know that one knows. In this way, we should have defined reflection of positional consciousness, or better, the knowledge of consciousness. This would be a complete consciousness directed towards something which is not it. That is, toward consciousness as object of reflection. It would be transcend itself, and like the positional consciousness of the world would be exhausted in aiming at its object, the object to be itself consciousness. It does not seem possible for us to accept the interpretation of the consciousness of consciousness. The reduction of consciousness to knowledge in fact involves our introducing into consciousness a subject-object dualism, which is typical of knowledge. But if we accept the law of knower known dyad, then a third term will be necessary in order for the knowledge to become known in turn. Then we will be faced with this dilemma. Either we stop at any one term of the series, the known, the knower, the knower, known by the knower, etc. In this case, the totality of the phenomenon falls into the unknown. That is, we always bump against non-self-conscious reflection and a final term, or else we affirm the necessity of an infinite regress, idea, etc., which is absurd. Thus, to the necessary of ontologically establishing consciousness, we would add a new necessity that an establishing is epistemologically are we obliged, after all, to introduce the law of the dyad of the consciousness of itself is not dual. If we wish to avoid an infinite regress, there must be an immediate non-cognitive relation of the self to itself. Furthermore, the reflecting consciousness posits the consciousness reflected on as its object. In the act of reflecting, I pass judgment on the consciousness reflected on. I am ashamed of it, I am proud of it, I will it, I deny it, etc. The immediate consciousness which I have of perceiving does not permit me either to judge or to will or to be ashamed. It does not know my perception, does not posit it. All that there is of intention is my actual consciousness, is directed towards the outside, towards the world. In turn, this spontaneous consciousness of my perception is constitutive of my perceptive consciousness. In other words, every possessional consciousness of an object is at the same time a non-positional consciousness of itself. If I can count the cigarettes which are in that case, I have the impression of disclosing an object property of this collection of cigarettes. They are a dozen. This property appears to my consciousness as a property existing in the world. It is very possible that I have no positional consciousness of counting them. Then I do not know myself as counting. Proof of this is that the children who are capable of making an addition spontaneously cannot explain subsequently how they set about at Piaget's test, which sure has constitute an excellent refutation of this formula of Elaine. To know it is to know that one knows, yet at the moment when these cigarettes are revealed to me as a dozen, I have a non-thetic consciousness of my adding activity. If anyone question me, indeed, if anyone should ask, what are you doing there? I should reply at once, I am counting. This doing there? I should reply at once. I reply aims not only at the instantaneous consciousness which I can achieve by reflection, but at those fleeting consciousnesses which have passed without being reflected on. These which are forever not reflected on in my immediate past, thus are forever not reflected on in my immediate past. Thus the reflection has no kind of primacy over the consciousness reflected on. It is not reflection which reveals the consciousness reflected on to itself. Quite the contrary, it is the non-reflective consciousness which renders the reflection possible. There is a pre-reflective cogito, which is the condition of the Cartesian cogito. At the same time, it is the non-theistic consciousness of the counting, which is in the very condition of my act adding. If it were otherwise, how would the addition be the unifying theme of my consciousness? In order that the theme should preside over a whole series of syntheses of unifications and recognitions, it must be present to itself not as a thing, but as an operative intention, which can exist only as a revealing, revealed, reveli, to use an expression of Heidegger's. Thus, in order to count, it is necessary to be conscious of counting. Of course, someone may say that this makes a circle, for thus it is not necessary that I count in fact in order to be conscious of counting. That is true. However, there is no circle, or if you like, it is the very nature of consciousness to exist in a circle. The idea can be expressed in these terms. Every conscious existence exists as consciousness of existing. We understand now why the first consciousness of consciousness is not positional. It is because it is one with consciousness of which is consciousness. At one stroke it determines itself consciousness of perception, and as perception the necessity of syntax has compelled us hitherto to speak of the non-positional consciousness of self, but we can no longer use the expression in which the of self still evokes the ideal of knowledge. Henceforth we shall be of inside parentheses to show that it merely satisfies a grammatical requirement. This self-consciousness we ought to consider not as a new consciousness, but as only a mode of existence, which is the object compelled to exist according to three dimensions. So an intention, a pleasure, a grief can exist as an immediate self-consciousness. If the intention is not a feminine consciousness, then the being of the intention can be only consciousness. If it is not necessary to understand by this that on the one hand some external cause, an organic trouble, an unconscious impulse, and another irritableness could determine that a psychic event of pleasure, for example, produced itself, then on the other hand that the event so determined in its material structure, this would be to make a non-thetic consciousness a quality of the positional consciousness, and the sense that the perception of positional consciousness of that table would have an addition to the quality of self-consciousness, and would thus fall back into the illusion of theoretical primacy of knowledge. This would be, moreover, to make the psychic events a thing and to qualify with consciousness, just as I can qualify this Berloff-Herford. Pleasure cannot be distinguished, even logically, from consciousness of pleasure. Consciousness of pleasure is constituted of the pleasure of the very mode of its existence, of the material of which it is made, and is not a form of which is imposed by a blow upon the hedonistic material. Pleasure cannot exist before consciousness of pleasure, not even in the form of potentially a potency. A potential pleasure can exist only as consciousness of being potential. Potencies of consciousness exist only as consciousness of potentialities. Conversely, as I have showed earlier, we must avoid defining pleasure by consciousness which I have of it. This would be to fall into an idealism of consciousness which would bring us by indirect means to the primacy of knowledge. Pleasure must not disappear behind its own self-consciousness. It is not a representation, it is a concrete event, full and absolute. It is no more a quality of self-consciousness than the self-consciousness is a quality of pleasure. There is no more the first of consciousness which receives subsequently the effect of pleasure. Like water which one stains, then is the first pleasure, unconscious or psychological, which conceives subsequently the quality of conscious, like a pencil of light rays. There is an indivisible, insoluble being, definitely not a substance supporting its qualities like particles of being, but a being which is existence through pleasure is the being of self-consciousness, and this self-conscious is the law of being of pleasure. This is what Heidegger expressed very well when he wrote, though speaking of Dasein, not of consciousness, The how essentia of being is so far as it is possible to speak of it generally must be conceived in terms of its existentia. This means that the consciousness is not produced as a particular instance of abstract possibility that is rising to the center of being. It creates and supports its essence that it is a synthetic order of possibilities. This means also that the type of being of consciousness is the opposite of that which is the ontological proof reveals to us, since the consciousness is not possible being before being. The sense its being is the source of the condition of all possibility. Its existence implies its essence. Husserl expresses that aptly than speaking of the necessity of fact. In order for there to be an essence of pleasure, there must be the first the fact of consciousness of this pleasure. It is futile to try to invoke pretend laws of consciousness of which articulated whole would constitute the essence. A law is a transcendent object of the knowledge. There can be consciousness of law, not a law of consciousness. For the same reasons, it is impossible to assign a consciousness of motivation other than itself. Otherwise, it would be necessary to conceive the consciousness to the degree of which it is the fact that is not conscious of itself. It would be necessary in some manner in which it would be whether of consciousness of being. We should fall into that too common illusion which makes consciousness semi-conscious or a passivity. But consciousness is consciousness through it can be limited only by itself. The self-determination of consciousness must be conceived as a genius, as becoming, for the word would force us to suppose the consciousness is prior to its own existence. Neither is it necessary to conceive of this self-creation as an act, for it is the case. Consciousness would be conscious of itself as an act, which is not consciousness in a plenum of existence, and the determination of itself by itself is an essential characteristic. It would even be wise to misuse the expression cause of self, which allows us to suppose the progression of relation of self-cause to self-effect. It would be more exact to say very simply the existence of consciousness comes from consciousness itself, but by their need not understand the consciousness arrives from nothingness. There cannot be nothingness of consciousness. Before consciousness, one can conceive only a phenomenon of being, of one which no element can refer to an absent consciousness. If there is to be nothingness of consciousness, there must be consciousness which must have been, which is no more, a witness consciousness, which poses the nothingness of the first consciousness for the synthesis of recognition. Consciousness is prior to nothingness and is derived from being. One will perhaps have one's difficulty in accepting these conclusions, but consider more carefully, they will appear perfectly clear. The paradox is not that there are self-actualized existences, but that there is no other kind. What is the true unthinkable is passive existence, that is, existence which is itself to preserve itself. From the point of view, there is nothing more incomprehensible than the principle of inertia. Indeed, there would be consciousness it did come from something, from the limbo of unconsciousness of the psychological. But if we ask ourselves how the limbo in its turn can exist, where it derives this existence, we find ourselves faced with the concept of passive existence. That is, we can no more absolutely understand how the non-conscious given unconscious of psychological, which does not derive its existence from itself, can nevertheless perpetuate the existence and find its addition to the ability to produce a consciousness. This demonstrates the great favor for which the proof of a cognitia mundi has enjoyed. Thus, the abounding of the primacy of knowledge, we have discovered the being of the knower and encountered the absolute, and the absolute, which is the rationalist of the 17th century, had defined the logically constituted as an object of knowledge, but precisely because the question concerns an absolute existence, not of knowledge. It is not a subject to that famous objection. According to that which is known, absolute is no longer an absolute because it becomes relative to the knowledge which one has of it. In fact, the absolute here is not the result of the logical construction on the ground of knowledge, but the subject of the most concrete of experiences, and is not all relative to the experience because it is the experience. Likewise, it is non-substantial absolute. The ontological error of the Cartesian rationalism is not to have seen that as the absolute is defined by the primacy of existence over essence. It cannot be conceived as substance. Consciousness has nothing as substantial. It is pure appearance in the sense that it exists only to the degree which it appears, but is precisely because consciousness is pure appearance, because it is total emptiness, since the entire world is outside it. It is because